Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Kowalski. Kyle is a solopreneur, a researcher, and an interdisciplinary thinker who is passionate about helping people live more intentional and fulfilling lives. Through Sloww, his website, his email subscription list, and also, like a personal journey, I dare to say, he shares his insights and discoveries with a global community of lifelong learners. And I've been watching and reading closely what ideas Kyle has been thrown to us, shared with us through his own journey, and I'm thankful for that. Kyle is also passionate about synthesizing lifelong learning that catalyzes human development. He shares these insights in Sloww.co, where he curates and shares thought-provoking content that encourages a slower and more intentional approach to life. Kyle, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. Looking forward to it. And thanks for the introduction.
I'm very happy to have this conversation. You know, the world seems like it's a very chaotic place nowadays, but your insights and how you've been synthesizing a lot of knowledge for us, people who want to have a journey into self-development, self-discovery, has been really an important part of keeping sanity, in a sense, and discovering our true potential here on Earth. I want to get to talk a bit about your trajectory here on Earth. How has been your trajectory unfolding up until today? And I'd like to discuss more of your insights as you had a 10-year tenure as a marketing professional.
Yeah, so great question. My trajectory really was unquestioned for the first 30 years of my life. So up until then, let's see, I guess at that point, so this is going back to late 2015 now. So coming up on the 8-year anniversary of that. So I'm in my late 30s now. But all the way up until my 30s, early 30s, really hadn't questioned anything about, at least any of the big questions about my life or life in general or anything like that. So really just found myself down a certain trajectory, a certain path that was unquestioned. And it took what I call a self-diagnosed existential crisis when I was 30 years, 8 months old, which is funny because other people are like, I'm having mine at 30 years, 8 months old. Or some people have them, in their late 20s. Some people are even lucky, I guess, lucky in a certain sense and have them in their teens. But of course, people have heard about like an identity crisis or a quarter life crisis. There's even the spiritual crisis. But I consider mine kind of a self-diagnosed existential crisis. And it came about because I was working just insane hours at my marketing job. So at this point in my career, I had been working in the marketing and advertising industry for about 8 years. And you can have ebbs and flows of high hour weeks in the marketing industry where it's not uncommon to work the 50, 60, 70, 80 plus hour weeks, but it's kind of you do it for a week here or a week there, and it kind of ebbs and flows. But this was different. For me, this was a 6 months straight, 60 to 80 hour work week thing that finally broke me. So after all the years in marketing, it finally broke me. And I remember going to bed at 2 or 3 a.m. every night after working. So I would do my typical, 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 work day. I would come home, my wife and I would have dinner. She would go to bed earlier, and then I would get back online and I would work from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. and go to sleep. And at a certain point, after 6 months of doing this, I just remember vividly, one night going to bed at 2 or 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and starting to ask myself all those deep questions in life along the lines of, I think it probably started with, and I guess for context, at this point in my career, I was a senior brand manager, working in like brand strategy and just, I guess, marketing in general at this time. And my responsibility was to completely renovate and reinvent the brand that I was working on. So it's a funny kind of ironic thing, right? That I'm in the midst of my own existential crisis while I'm getting paid in my day job to reinvent a brand that is in its own existential or identity crisis. And this was a 100-plus-year-old clothing or apparel brand, and my job was to reinvent it. So here I am, 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, staring at the ceiling, and I remember vividly my question, I believe, started with, am I really here on this planet for this short period of time to sell people more stuff they don't need? And that was my first question, because I was killing myself with work hours. And it wasn't necessarily the high hours. It was partially that, right? Because that leads to burnout if you do it for a long enough period of time. But it was the high hours combined with a lack of purpose. And that kind of dual threat combo is what finally did me in and broke me in terms of starting to ask all these questions about, am I really here to do this? And if I'm not here to do this, then what am I here to do? And what is purpose? And, you start asking Google all these different questions, anything you can imagine. I probably searched it sometime in late 2015 or 2016, trying to figure out, well, if it's not this, then what is my purpose? And so that's really what set the course and trajectory for my 8 years since then of trying to figure that out. Wow.
That question in itself, that on time and how we're investing our time to do quote unquote meaningless things such as selling products or whatever, is one of the deepest, hardest questions one can ask. And I'm very inspired that you were able to ask yourself that question and overcome it. But during your tenure as a marketing professional and, before this awakening, were there any clues along the road that this wasn't it for you? This wasn't really what you were looking for, and there was something. I know you said you didn't really question it, but were there in the background these little arrows that were saying this is not it?
There were clues in the sense of clues that were planted almost like seeds along the way that I didn't realize were clues until after the fact, right? So it's one of those things that upon reflection, you can kind of look back and see, oh, that was a clue, or that was a seed, or these dots connect now in my life path. And I can see, at this point, I feel like I've dissected almost each and everything I can about myself and my personality and psychology and things like that. And I can see, going all the way back to my birth and my childhood and my schooling and even my career, I can kind of see what those clues are now. But the interesting point is that I didn't have those, top of mind or conscious while I was going through it. They were only things that I could connect looking back. And I didn't have, in a lot of cases, even the words to be able to articulate what those things were while I was in the midst of it. It wasn't something until, upon reflection, I'm able to say, oh, that's exactly what I was going through. So yeah, I can definitely see a lot of those clues and seeds now, but I wish I could have seen them, more in the moment. But yeah.
Yeah. And what do you think, the biggest lessons you had, not after the fact, but during the fact, when you say you were reinventing your own brand, and also the brand of the company, you were trying to invent yourself and going through this crisis, those lessons of of the world, because it sounds like even metaphysical, it sounds like the world was trying to tell you something. How were these two worlds, even though they seem to be colliding, were connecting for you?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what I've been trying to do from a personal perspective is it's almost trying to figure out who I am versus who I'm trying to become. So a lot of what I've tried to do is figure out, ask those know thyself questions, right? Of who am I? And the who am I question is really interesting because that can get you, initially what it does is it gets you into your personal psychology, right? So people do the, personality type tests or the Enneagram or DISC or Strengths Finder and all these types of things. And that's a helpful phase to go through, right? To understand, oh, I'm wired this way and not that way. And it helps not only intrapersonally with understanding your own psychology, but it helps interpersonally by understanding, oh, people are actually different. And, people have different desires. They have different just modes of being and things like that. So that who I am question really gets you into your own psychology at first. And then if you keep going on that question, that's kind of what gets you into the spiritual realm of not in the woo-woo way, but in the way of asking like the Ramana Maharshi question or self-inquiry or whatever of who am I? And it takes you beyond your psychology and beyond your mind. So things get even more interesting. If you thought it was interesting on the psychological front, it gets even more interesting on the spiritual front. But what I was really trying to do, and in a lot of cases still am trying to do, is really figure out who I am versus trying to reinvent myself from a perspective of, oh, I want to be this and have that be a driver from the wrong place, if that makes sense, right? You don't want it to be extrinsically motivated or like identity based, or you're trying to kind of puff yourself up with labels or build up your ego or anything like that. It's more of like trying to figure out who you are and then aligning your life and your lifestyle design in a way where who you are is just something that naturally flows out, and you're pursuing your purpose in what you feel is a natural and authentic way. And your life is kind of then built around that, where it can almost be like a virtuous flywheel effect of you're showing up, you're doing it daily, and everything almost just flows naturally for you.
Wow. And it seems, on my perspective, what you said on, being 30 years without questioning it, it seems that it could be really hard to unfold. It would be hard to untangle that web of unquestioning and trying to change your identity or even question your identity in an 180 degree turnaround. So my question here is, how were you able to do that and thrive? How were you able to untangle your own self without wrecking yourself along the way? Or maybe that was part of the process to build yourself up, and in such a fast turnover, because what I understand from you is this was you've been 8 years doing this new awakening phase of your life, and self-inquiring, and also working in Sloww, doing the newsletter, doing the website. So my own curiosity here is, it's almost the uncertainty of questioning it and not being a wrecking ball during the process.
Yeah, I think the acute, I almost refer to phases in life now as pre-crisis and post-crisis, because that's how pivotal of a period it was. And that acute, I call it the acute portion of the crisis, when I was 30, was about a 6-week period. Although, of course, you can't put a dead end on a crisis, right? But it was about a 6-week really deep dive down all of these different questions and things like that. And I remember watching documentaries about life and about nature. I was almost doing anything I could it was like a question and answer phase. It was like me questioning and hoping that life could give me the answers, mediated through Google and documentaries and videos and all these other things, right? But that's the beauty of the internet. And what's great is that, if someone is going through something like this today in 2023, it's such a better time to go through it, because the amount of content out there about this type of stuff is exponentially greater than when I went through it. And the quality, if the quantity is greater, then the quality is also greater, right? Because there's more content, the better quality stuff is going to bubble up to the top. You'll be able to seek that out. But that stuff just didn't exist in quantity or quality when I was going through it. And so I was really stumbling my way through it in the dark. But what was interesting was, when I was in the midst of my crisis, my natural response was, this is a problem that I have to figure out. And so I kind of put it on myself of, if I have a lack of purpose, and if I'm not finding my career purposeful anymore, nearing a decade in, and if I just jump to another marketing job or something like that and continue my career, is that really going to be something new and different and fill the void of what I had? Or is it just going to be same thing, different company, right? And at this point, I had been working, this was my 4th job in marketing in 8 years. So I kind of finally got the memo that, another new job in marketing isn't going to cut it. That didn't mean it was necessarily easy to quit the career and make that final, rip the Band-Aid off moment. But it did kind of give me a little bit of insight in terms of, okay, maybe this isn't the thing or whatever. It wasn't until years later when I started thinking about what allowed me in the midst of my crisis to even have a proactive mindset of, this is my problem to figure out kind of thing. And that's been really interesting for me over the last couple of years is, I questioned everything about life and what I thought was myself and all of that during the crisis itself in the following year. But I didn't question how I got the mindset in the first place that allowed me to proactively and productively respond to the crisis. So that has been an interesting rabbit hole I've been diving in. It's like almost a second layer down in terms of, how did I ever get that brain and mind in the first place that, one, that had a crisis, 2, that responded in the way it did, and things like that. So that's gotten me into a whole bunch of other topics like psychological development and the lottery of birth and neuroscience and biology and nature and nurture, all these types of things, socialization and conditioning, you name it. I've kind of been going down that rabbit hole for the last year or two, and kind of going to that deeper level of how did I ever become me in the first place, me on the psychological level. And that's been just a fascinating, eye-opening thing. And people seem to think initially that would be a limiting thing, but I've found it to be the opposite. I found it to be very liberating in terms of realizing all the things that make me me that I didn't necessarily choose or control along the way, from birth to early childhood and things like that. So this is probably a long-winded answer and tangent, but obviously there's a lot of nuance to it and a lot of phases that have happened along the way in the last 8 years. Yeah,
I love the answer. There's 4 topics that I would really like to cover. I've already put a note on them, which are regarding to the lottery of birth, the socialization, how we really get to a point where we follow society's rules and then those go unquestioned and we don't even have the space or mindset to figure out who we are. And how did I become myself, like you say? How does that happen? Which are 3 really interesting questions that I want to cover. But before that, you mentioned how you ripped off the Band-Aid. And it's inspiring to see that you did rip the Band-Aid, and you also took a leap of faith, a very daring leap of faith. I would like to ask you if you could walk me through that process of finally making the decision of, what, this is not doing it for me. My career in marketing is not doing it for me. And how were those conversations with, family members, companies, everyone around you? How was that happening? What was the feedback that you were receiving, and how were you able to overcome? Probably you were encountering a lot of, are you crazies, no? Like people saying you're messing your life up.
Yeah, I actually, it's funny because when I was in the midst of my crisis, and I guess this now would be maybe like early 2016, I created a Google Doc called How to Have an Existential Crisis. And I was saving all of my insights and notes and stuff that I was watching. I remember at the time there was like a Cosmos series on TV that I was watching, and I was learning about the blue zones where people, the 5 or 6 places on Earth where people live to be over 100 years old. Per capita and highest density of those people. So I was learning all these interesting things. It's also when I discovered intentional living. Like I had no idea that intentional living was a thing. I had no idea that slow living, simple living, minimalism. This is when I discovered all of those concepts for the first time, which was really inspiring because I had gone down, well, my wife and I had gone down the path of what I call lifestyle inflation, where you get the job, you get the better job, you get paid more, you get the house, you get the bigger house, you get the car, you get the sports car, that whole thing. We had lived and learned the hard way. And I described the 2.5 years after my crisis and quitting my career. That's how long it was. So 2.5 years after my crisis, I was still working full time in my marketing career. And those 2.5 years, I call my 2.5 years of cognitive dissonance, where I continue to spend all my free time essentially looking for purpose and learning about life. And the more that I learned about myself and about life in general, the bigger the cognitive dissonance grew in terms of what I was learning, but how I was still living. So I was learning all this stuff and starting to figure out a little bit about what my purpose was. And a lot of figuring out who you are and what your purpose is and things like that is a matter of figuring out what it's not. Right. So you start to figure out, I'm not that, I'm not wired that way. This doesn't, resonate with me. So you start to figure out, okay, these aren't directions that I want to go, or energy that doesn't resonate or whatever, which is a really helpful way to figure out, well, then who are you and what could your purpose be? But those 2.5 years were really, really rough. And there was just like an increasing boiling point up until the point where this is now, let's say, early 2018. Still working at this point. I had been promoted at my marketing job, so all the hard work and killing myself, that was pre-crisis, ended up paying off, in traditional terms. But here I am, with the highest salary I've ever had and the biggest house we'll probably ever have, which we no longer own, and sports car and like all these, material luxury things, and the 6-figure salary and benefits and stock options and that whole deal. But I was the most miserable that I had ever been in those 2.5 years. So that was a big wake up call, right? It's like you've really got to figure something out at that point to change your trajectory in some way, shape, or form, to pivot your life in some way, because I felt like I was dying inside. Like my career was just like killing me inside. The lack of purpose was just growing and growing and growing, and the cognitive dissonance was growing and growing and growing. And so it got to the point where 2.5 years later, it's still not an easy decision to quit a decade-long career, of course. But it got to the point where I had applied for some other jobs. I had that realization that no, these would be the same thing at a different company. And then the final job that I ever applied for, I got just flat out rejected from, which ended up being a blessing in disguise, right? Because I had exhausted all options in my marketing career. I had no other job prospects available. And it was just one of those things where like, I got to try this entrepreneurship thing. I had this like bug in my system that's like, I've got to give it a go. And I know that it might fail, right? There are no guarantees in entrepreneurship, but I've got to get it out of my system and at least give it a shot. Before I die, I've got to give it a try. And so that was finally and my wife has been the biggest supporter along the way. She does admit, and she would tell you if she was sitting next to me, that she was worried about me during my crisis. We had only been married for 4 years at that point. We've been married, it'll be 12 years this year. But she's been along for the whole journey, the whole ride. And she says she was worried about me during the crisis, because she had never seen me like that before, right? It was something new in our relationship that she hadn't seen before. And then I think it helped a lot that 2 years after my crisis, she had her own crisis. I call hers an extrinsic crisis because hers were external questions of like, what's the nature of reality? What's the universe? All the stuff that we consider outside of you. And I consider mine an intrinsic crisis because mine were, what's my purpose? Who am I? Why am I here on earth for this short time? Like all those, very subjective internal questions. But I think that helped because over the next couple of years, she kind of came along for the evolution of everything, saw me get more and more miserable in my career, and finally, gave the okay that, yeah, okay, you can try this entrepreneurship thing. And I tell people now that I'm just going to keep doing it as long as she'll let me. But yeah.
Wow. There's a quote that I remember now that I tweeted once that said, the best thing that ever happened to you is that maybe that which it never happened. That quote, like maybe life and the dreams that we seek, that believe we want to seek, maybe are those that when they don't happen is the best thing to ever happen to us. Mm-hmm. And your story resonates with me a lot. Now I'm navigating my own self-discovery and you can say a quarter-life crisis in a way. And your story and how your wife was supportive of you is really, really admirable. And one question that I had was, when you said how did I become myself? How did that happen? And you also mentioned the lottery of birth. You also mentioned the socialization. You also mentioned all of these external factors happening without our control. How were you able to objectively figure out by yourself what was resonating with you? What was the voice of society in your mind? What was the voice of other people? And was this more of an intuition led approach? Was this more a rational approach? I know you synthesize a lot of information, but what was the navigating compass in this self-discovery?
So I think the navigating compass was just starting with a foundation of not being afraid to ask any question, no matter how ridiculous you think it might be on the surface or how weird you might think it might be or something like that. It's almost like just being willing to ask the question in the first place and just seek out whatever the answer might be and not necessarily being judgmental about the answer. So asking questions and being open to whatever comes back. So in terms of just my own process, and of course, this has been a slowly evolving process over the last 8 years in terms of it started with intentional living and then it got into life purpose. And then I found a stage of then getting into psychology and the mind. So once you have purpose, it's probably not uncommon to ask the question, well, what is purpose? How did humans ever come up with purpose? Is this just a concept in your mind, or is this, something through evolution? Or does it have a biological basis? So you start asking the questions about like, well, what is that thing in the first place? It's kind of like there's a concept called the 5 whys. where you ask a question and then you get an answer and then you question that answer and then you keep doing that. And so ultimately with any question, you're going to hit a dead end of mystery, at a certain point. And it doesn't take too many questions to hit that mystery. But it's kind of started there for me. And then that has taken me into a realization of even what you would call the spiritual stuff of beyond mind. So at a certain point, your psychology and all the mental stuff, mind stuff, brain stuff can only take you so far. And then you get into the concepts like awareness and presence and even things like non-duality and stuff like that in the spiritual space. And I would have never considered, what's funny is, growing up or, let's just even go 10 years ago, I would have never considered myself a spiritual person, right? I wasn't even a big reader. My worst grades in school growing up were reading. I was just a really slow reader, which now I call thorough. But it was always a perceived weakness, right? Growing up. So it's funny how something that you grew up with as a perceived weakness can actually turn out to be a strength. It didn't turn out that I was actually, bad in reading. It was just that I just read really thoroughly. And I would never finish tests on time or anything like that. But it's things like that in terms of trying to get to know yourself. And then in terms of, dissecting my own lottery of birth ticket, if you will, I have a post on the Sloww website about this, where I've tried to dissect everything I can about myself. So all the nature stuff in terms of I didn't pick any of my genetics or any neurons in my brain or any cells in my body. I didn't pick my biological makeup, or if someone's born with health issue, like chronic health issues or anything like that. You don't choose any of those things, right? And then they can impact your life for the long term. And then all the nurture stuff. So you obviously have no say in the world that you're born into. So the geographic location in which you're born, the time period in which you're born, your parents, the nurturing that you get from your parents, the education that your parents put you into, all of these things, any traumas or miracles that you have along the way, all of these things shape the brain and the mind that you end up having later in life. It's one of those realizations that, when people think as an adult, oh, my childhood, they reference their childhood like it's some detached thing that no longer influences them. But in reality, it influences everything. All the things that came before influence all the things that come after. All those things are downstream. And so it's a matter of kind of figuring out. I think there's something too when people say, well, what did you want to be when you were a kid? I didn't say as a kid, I want to grow up to be a synthesizer and solopreneur or anything like that. Right. But I can see the seeds of things as a child of I've always been super introverted. I grew up really shy and quiet. So I've always kind of had this outside observer view on life of being the quiet one in the back of the room or whatever, and just kind of observing things going on. So that's obviously a big part of shaping just how I'm wired and what I do now. And then in terms of finding information and trying to figure all this stuff out for myself, it was just a natural response to me to start asking questions and then just consuming information. It's just the way that I'm wired. Howard Gardner calls it a synthesizing mind. There's another thing called interdisciplinary studies. So I guess one benefit of not having gone to school for any of this stuff is I don't have a disciplinary, siloed focus of I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a spiritual guru, I'm not a scientist. I have no special letters before or after my name. And I think that in a way is a good thing, because I have just this open kind of view on, well, let me look at this from biology, and this from neuroscience, and this from psychology, and this from philosophy, and this from spirituality, you name it, metaphysics, consciousness, whatever. Let me look at all of everything as much as I can and take a holistic picture and interconnect the dots and try to make better sense for myself what might be going on. And through that process over the years, it has just led to just a whole newfound perspective on life, better ways to make meaning in life. There's a concept called psychological development that we can get into also if you want. But it's been a journey, but all for the best in the long run.
Yeah, and the book goes, you sort of have the generalist mind rather than the pinpoint, narrow down mind, which provides a lot of opportunities to explore many venues for to get to know oneself. Kyle, I'm curious to get more in depth into your ideas on lottery of birth. I know you've been doing a deeper research on it, and I'm curious to know, do you think the lottery, first of all, your thoughts, you mentioned it previously, but deeper in a deeper way, I would like to get to know to that. And also, do you think the lottery of birth favors more people, or it does this favor for more people?
So the lottery of birth, for those who haven't heard of it, there's actually a few great TED Talks on YouTube to check out. There's even a documentary by a guy named Raul Martinez, who also has a book called Creating Freedom. And the whole first part of his book is about this concept called the lottery of birth and its implications, and a lot of the empirical research and data that now support the concept as well. But the idea is that you didn't choose or control any of your nature, the things we walked through previously. You didn't choose or control any of your nurture, which we also walked through. And all of these have downstream implications in your life. A big popularizer of the concept is Warren Buffett. He calls it the ovarian lottery, and he frames it as a thought experiment. So he actually throws out the idea that if you are going to be born in 24 hours, and you have to choose one lottery ball out of, there are now 8 billion-ish humans on Earth. So you have to choose one out of 8 billion lottery balls. And you don't know what you're going to get, right? The odds of you choosing your own current lottery ball are 1 in 8 billion. So very low odds that you're going to choose you again. You're going to choose somebody else. And if you had to go through that process, but you had the power to design society in any way that you would want, how would you design society? And it's a really interesting question, right? Because if you don't know who you're going to be in society, then how would you design it? You would probably design it in a way where those who, quote unquote, get losing lottery tickets still have a pretty good life, right? You want to minimize your losses, but you still don't want to limit the people who are born with, quote unquote, winning tickets, where they can still strive and reach potential and all those types of things. But I think he got this idea from John Rawls, who calls it the original position or veil of ignorance thought experiment. But once I came across this, it blew my mind, because it kind of converged on everything else I had been learning up until that point and at that moment. And it made me realize and start asking those questions about, how did I ever become who I am? And that's where you start asking, did I choose my biological sex? Did I choose where I was born? Did I choose when I was born? Did I choose my parents? Did I choose my personality type? Did I choose my gifts or talents or strengths? And you, at least the way that I've done it, is I answered this question as no, I didn't have a choice in those things, and I didn't control those things. And once you realize that, Raul Martinez, the author of Creating Freedom, has a quote that says that true responsibility is acknowledging all those things that you weren't responsible for. And it's this kind of paradox, right? You can't realize that you are conditioned until you've already been conditioned. You don't realize that you have an identity until you already have one. And it's just a kind of fascinating period to go through in terms of, asking all those questions, learning more about yourself, giving you greater compassion for others. Because once you realize it about yourself, right, you realize that it applies to everybody else too. And it just gives you a sense of universal and unconditional compassion that maybe you didn't have before. Hatred no longer makes logical sense once you have these realizations. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's really interesting that question of how would you build society with that in mind. It's a really interesting question. One that I'm not ready to answer yet.
Yeah.
But it's a very good question. Of course, with what you said, the pretense would be, of course, lessening the suffering of everyone, with more compassion, more love for everyone. But it's interesting how this lottery plays a deeper role that we think on our lives and our trajectories, and how it sort of undermines our concept of free will in a sense. But paradoxically, like you say, once you realize the no's in the life we are embarking on, it amplifies the yeses. So it's an interesting paradox. It's an interesting way of looking at free will. Once you realize, hey, up until today, a lot of factors I didn't really had a say in how to price in my life. But now that I'm aware of, there's a lot of gamut of possibilities that I can embark on. And also knowing which ones trigger sort of my traits, which ones don't, which is really interesting. And Kyle, you also previously you touched on intentional living. It's a very interesting concept and one you've personally embarked on. And I want to get into that concept as well for our listeners. What is intentional living, and how has been your experience in understanding, like you said previously, that, the fancy car is not going to really cut it for my purpose. All of the inflationary lifestyle is really a scam in a way.
Yeah, like I said, I had to live and learn the hard way here. And hopefully not everyone has to live and learn the hard way. But my wife and I did the lifestyle inflation thing. And I ultimately just got to the point that no amount of pleasure makes up for a lack of purpose. And that's a big wake up call, right? I had the house, the car, the salary, all the things, but I was the most miserable and unhappy and unpurposeful and unfulfilled that I had ever been in my life. And so that was part of the big, 2.5 years of cognitive dissonance that led to that. And there are a lot of different moving pieces around the same time. I had discovered the FIRE movement at this time. So financial independence, retire early, which just gives you a whole newfound perspective on money and household expenses and how you're spending your own money and things like that. But in terms of intentional living, the way that I use the term intentional living is almost like an umbrella term that encapsulates all these sub-concepts like simple living and slow living and downshifting and minimalism and decluttering and more recently digital minimalism. So all of these types of concepts I would kind of consider under intentional living. And the way a lot of people have heard of simple living, or at least have like an intuitive idea of what that kind of entails. But the way that I describe slow living, which less people have heard of, is the idea that what simple living is for your things, slow living is for your time. Or what simple living is for your space, slow living is for your pace. So you have the like time and space aspects of life. So simple living is just like people think about your physical stuff, right? The Marie Kondo decluttering phase. There's also a thing called the no buy year, which I did with clothing. So I just opted to say, I'm going to spend $0 on clothing for a year. So there are all these different like experiments and challenges that you can do with yourself from like a physical stuff perspective. And then the other piece of it is obviously like the time piece and your relationship with time. And, I had been a busyaholic and a workaholic, and it took me forever to realize that my self-worth during my career had been tied directly to my work. And so that was a big aha moment. And then the other piece was just figuring out why I was so busy and why it seems like we have this glorification of busyness right now. And so I have a post series on the Sloww website about like diving deep into busyness and the root causes of busyness. And are we busier today than people were in the past and all those types of things, which obviously pairs nicely with what once you kind of diagnose that for yourself and why you might be so busy, then you can shift into the slow living series, which is all about, slow living and how to downshift into that kind of lifestyle and things like that. But that was a really critical part. And honestly, it's why Sloww is named Sloww, because I think it was like Christmas Day, 2015. This is in the midst of my crisis. I had discovered some of these things already in those couple weeks of the crisis. And I emailed my dad, just bought the domain sloww.co, discovered concepts like slow living and simple living and minimalism. And I think I might do something with this because it was so different and contrarian and alternative to the life I had been living. And I initially saw it as an escape. Like this is how I escaped my career, right? Because I think my whole life I had been an entrepreneur at heart, but never knew it. And I stumbled into a marketing career and woke up, 8 to 10 years ago and wondered how I got there. But the intentional living stuff was the seed for everything else and gave me the space to start asking those deeper questions and look into life purpose and go deeper into all those pieces.
And you mentioned entrepreneurship now, and I want to get to that as well. You start pursuing solopreneurship in mid-2018, and it's sort of the moment where you're having this awakening where this might be a great way of pursuing what I love, and also from what I see and from my standpoint, also sharing my own thoughts for other people to understand not only what I'm going through, but also how to navigate these big questions in life. So how was entrepreneurship a big pivotal moment in your life? And do you think a lot of entrepreneurs have this crisis beforehand when they decide to embark on that role?
Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of entrepreneurs, like hopefully, again, this isn't something that a lot of people have to live and learn the hard way, although unfortunately it seems like it is. But I never in life, well, I guess I did have some entrepreneurial endeavors in college. Like I sold graphic T-shirts for some events and things like that with a friend, which were completely from scratch. That we kind of teamed up and did. So I had some, again, these are seeds, right? These are clues and seeds that I didn't realize in the moment and didn't piece together until after the fact. But I had been working on entrepreneurial side ideas for the entire length of my career. So I actually had a side, I call it like a eco-friendly lifestyle apparel brand that I had been working on from 2009 to 2018. The whole time I was fully employed. So I had these like entrepreneurial dreams and was dabbling in things, but not completely seriously. But again, it was one of those things where finally it clicked, where it was like, I just think I need to just do this. It was like this finally aha moment. And of course I was backed into the corner, right, where I got rejected from my last job I applied for in marketing. And it was like, okay, there are no other options. Now is the time to give this a try. There's a quote that I came across in my crisis that is something along the lines of, there's no better time for a midlife crisis because you never know when the middle of your life will be. Which is kind of like this powerful epiphany of like, no one knows how much time they have on Earth, right? And it could be tomorrow, it could be 40 years from now. Who knows? In 40 years, maybe we'll be living forever. I have no idea. But the whole idea is that at this moment, you have no idea how much time you have. So for me, that played into it, right? Because it was like, I got to give this a shot. And that was a big piece of it too. But so I think I had been an entrepreneur at heart who had entrepreneurial dreams my whole career and just didn't realize it until 10 years in or so, and finally made the move on it. But yeah.
That's really interesting. And like you say, this awakening of really we're here, and I'm knocking on wood, we're here for a good 100 years, 80 years, if like, again, knock on wood, if all goes well. And what's really staggering for me is how you say the emergence of busyness and the emergence of tying up our identities with our careers and with our job titles and with the medals that we hang up in the wall, all of those things. Really, when you put it in perspective and when we extrapolate, and when I extrapolate my own time on Earth, when I'm 80 and I look at all of those walls filled with achievements, it still doesn't cut it for me, in the sense that I would rather 100% more have those walls filled with pictures of people that I love, of things that I enjoy doing, of memories, rather than these pats in the back, like saying it was meaningful what you did, which is really, really striking. And like you say, we really don't know how much time we have here. And the best way of figuring it out first is, like you say, asking those questions and daring to find the answers, which can be uncomfortable, have been uncomfortable. But also, having this deeper glance into why we're here on Earth, other than doing output for meaningless stuff that honestly a lot of us continue doing. And maybe a lot of people right now who are listening or will listen in the future might be experiencing these questions, but there is really, even though a lot of people discuss it in a way that this crisis happened, I feel it's been normalized in a way that these midlife crises happen when, boom, it really, you really figure out that life is not forever. And then most of people, that's why, like, you inspire me, most of people just go along the way, like it's a natural part of your life, it's normal, this will fade out, and you took action on it. So what would you say for those people who might be experiencing this or have this tingling that, there's a deeper purpose there, but are hesitant to take that leap of faith into discovering oneself?
Yeah, I would just reiterate the importance of just not being afraid to ask any question, no matter how ridiculous you think it may be. It's amazing how many people there are now that the world is connected online. It's amazing how many people are out there asking exactly the question that you're asking at this given moment. And like I said, it's a much better time to be asking these questions now versus 8 years ago when the information was much more limited. But there is information out there. It does exist. And I mean, that's really why Sloww exists, right? Is because I was asking these questions, I was learning stuff along the way, and I was stumbling my way through it because I couldn't find a lot of good resources on a lot of these things back when I was having mine. And there's a concept that I just came across called the transformative learning. A guy named Jack Mesereau came up with this concept like a number of decades ago. I think he may have passed away, but basically what it is it's almost like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey in a way, but in terms of adult learning and adult development. So it's really cool, and it's amazing how much it aligns with it. But it starts with the first step of a 10-phase transformative learning process is a disorienting dilemma. So any dilemma that you're going through, whether it's a identity crisis or midlife crisis or quarter life crisis or existential crisis, all of those can be considered a disorienting dilemma. And that sets you down a path of the transformative learning journey, which ultimately comes back around full circle, just like the hero's journey, and it ends with a perspective transformation. And I'm now 8 years into doing this, and I just came across this stuff, a month or two ago. So it's all these things that, I wish I could have come across sooner and would have been helpful, but this concept just aligns with so much stuff that it like pieces all these disparate dots together that I've had for years now, and it puts them together in a single package. But the idea is that, this ties hand in hand with psychological development and new perspective on life. And it's just a wonderful concept that I would encourage people to check out. I have a few book summaries on the Sloww website about it, but, yeah, just don't be afraid to start asking those questions. Acknowledge that you are in a disorienting dilemma. And part of it is what Jack talks about is the importance of having at least one other person that you can lean on. So for me, it was my wife. But whether it's a spouse or partner or a close friend or family member, or whoever it may be, or even someone that you find online, right? Someone might be going through what you're going through online, and you might sync up and connect with them and go through it together. That can be a really powerful thing. So finding one other person at least that you can go through all of this with, and being open to whatever you learn and whatever life tells you through it. The last thing that I wanted to do, I guess part of the reason why I feel like I'm open to it is the last thing that I want to do in this process is delude myself further, right? I had the crisis and I had the lack of purpose and all that. And the last thing that I want to do is lie to myself, any narrative bias or cognitive biases or things like that. I try to eliminate as much as I can and just be as honest as possible with myself about my strengths and my weaknesses. It's very clear to me what a lot of my weaknesses were now in terms of growing up. I had this idea that I don't know where it came from because my parents never said this, but I had this weird fear of disappointing my parents. I don't know where it came from because my parents are two of the coolest people I know, but I somehow got this, meme in my head or whatever of don't disappoint your parents, which meant get good grades. It meant, do good in sports, try hard in everything you do. And that kind of built this work ethic that was tied directly to my self-worth. And for me, money was never a primary motivator. It was always I need to do really quality work so that I feel worthwhile as a person. And that was a really big, wake-up call of why I was working so hard and how to disentangle, who you are from the work that you do, and that you aren't your job title and things like that. But that was a lot of stuff that I had to go through because I was living that life. And again, I didn't realize it in the moment, but looking back, it's very clear now. But being open and honest with yourself is a key part of the whole process.
Yeah. And it's going to be really interesting in how people are going to use ChatGPT and these AI new technologies to ask those questions and what kind of answers will it yield. If it's not a community-based answer, these algorithms may pivot us into a completely different, path that hopefully it's better, but it's going to be really interesting how people use these AI technologies for that, which I do believe maybe Sloww could use, like a chat for that. I would use it. It would be really interesting.
Yeah, I love to. I haven't played around with a lot of the AI tools yet, but I'd love to feed, the entire Sloww website. I'd love to feed the Sloww website plus my like entire Obsidian backup vault, which I have like backed up my 15,000 tweets on Twitter and all my book summaries, like my original book summary notes and everything. I'd love to feed it all into a single thing and then be able to query that. I think that would be super cool. But maybe, I mean, maybe some people will even use an AI tool as their person, quote unquote person that they're leaning on to go through this process. And maybe it can be an aid and a catalyst for them as something that they can lean on. So, I mean, I'm hopeful that technology and AI tools and even things like psychedelics and things like that, I'm hopeful that they can be used in a way that are aids to increase psychological development.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned psychological development and, technology. And also there's a concept that you've been working on, which is Ikigai. And I don't know if that's really connected with psychological development, but I would like to do those connections. You've redesigning Ikigai into Ikigai 2.0 in an ebook. And first of all, for our listeners, what is Ikigai and how does that relate with psychological development, and how can we get the most out of ourselves, our development, through those new pieces of information?
Yeah, so in terms of how Ikigai and psychological development connect, I guess first of all is that I think if you look up, there are a million different psychological development frameworks and theories and things like that. Some of the big ones that people have heard of are like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. A lot of people now have heard of like Ken Wilber's integral theory. Another big one is like Robert Kegan's theory of adult development. So you have these kind of big name players in the space. And then the one that I have resonated with the most that I've come across to date is Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory. And it goes through a number of different phases. And the idea is that there's a difference between horizontal development and vertical development. So when you think of horizontal development, it's what you think. So it's information, it's knowledge, it's skills, almost like an XY axis of the horizontal line is all of that type of stuff of what you think, the content that you think. And then the vertical development line or the vertical axis is how you think. So it's much rarer. Obviously, it's much more common to add a bunch of new information and content to your mind, learn new hard skills and things like that. It's much rarer to vertically develop in the sense that as you develop, you gain higher perspective on life, more holistic perspective on life. It allows you to take meaning or make meaning in new ways. So that is more along the lines of transformation, where the other horizontal line is more about like information, or they call it like translation. So the first thing is to kind of understand that a lot of these frameworks follow that idea of horizontal versus vertical development. In terms of where purpose fits into all of this, it seems like a certain stage of psychological development, whether you call it in Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory, she calls it like moving into the post-conventional stages of life. In Robert Kegan's theory of adult development, he might call this something like self-authoring. So it's kind of goes back to that whole socialization and conditioning thing we talked about, where that has to happen first, right? There's no way around a human not getting socialized. But then at a certain point, you do seem to have some sense of agency and autonomy to start asking these questions, realizing these things about yourself, figuring out purpose. And that seems to be a key part of a certain phase in psychological development. In terms of Ikigai, back when I was searching for purpose, and if no one has heard of the concept before, the easiest thing to do is probably Google Ikigai, and it gives you this Japanese concept called Ikigai. Unfortunately, what you'll find when you search it, for the most part, is a 4-circle Venn diagram, which is the overlapping intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. And the nice thing is that this meme is out there and people are talking about it, and that's the good side of it. The downside of it is that it doesn't match the reality of Ikigai in Japan and what it actually means. So what I did with Ikigai 2.0 and what I eventually put into this ebook was 5 years off and on of learning about this concept in greater detail and doing a lot of the myth busting around, well, if the 4-circle diagram isn't actually reality, then what is it? And so I redesigned it and I called it Ikigai 2.0 to rework the framework to be more closely linked to what Ikigai actually means in Japan. And the big thing is that the circle of what you can be paid for isn't really a consideration in terms of finding your reason for being or your purpose or things like that. Not to mention, you can have multiple purposes. They can change over the course of your lifetime. Some might make money, some might not. But the way that I reworked it is that money is not one of the critical circles, but it can be an optional byproduct of, if you figure out the other three circles, then by pursuing that and having a virtuous flywheel effect, you might make money from doing that purpose in action.
It's really interesting. And like you say, the money equation is really a byproduct and externality of finding one's purpose. And it shouldn't, I agree. I share with you that the Ikigai concept shouldn't really put that in the Venn diagram as the essential component of it, but rather as an externality. Kyle, as we begin to wrap up, I know you're working also on developing online courses, which I will put the link to it in the show for all of our listeners, as well as all of your websites and all of your information in the internet. But I'm interested in, you're developing these online courses, which are a synthesizer course and then a course for each of the Sloww stages. So can you walk us through what is the synthesizer course and also what are these Sloww stages?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the first things that I figured out was when you're going through all the stages of who am I, how am I wired, and things like that, I, at some point along the journey, discovered that I have what Howard Gardner calls a synthesizing mind. I didn't even know what the word synthesis meant. I didn't know what synthesizing mind was or synthesizer. Some people call it being a synthesist. I had never heard these terms, right? And that's a recurring theme in a lot of this journey is you don't have the words initially to be able to articulate what you already intuitively know and feel. So having the words and coming across the concepts gives you these light bulb moments of, oh, yeah, that's exactly how my mind already seems to naturally work. But over the years, what I've done is I've kind of honed a process that I use for Sloww in terms of, whether it's how I pick books, how I create a reading list, how I prioritize books, how I read, just in terms of, not being a reader to now just being almost like a full-time reader. I've honed a bunch of skills for reading, how I take notes, how I create a book summary, how I create a synthesis of multiple books, or, in one case, I did a synthesis of Maria Popova of Brain Pickings, or now called The Marginalian, where I looked at 50 different pieces of content. So all of her interviews, all of her YouTube videos, all of her podcasts, a bunch of articles she's written on her own website, and I put 50 plus pieces of content into a single article. So it's like, what's the process for doing a kind of like ultimate synthesis and things like that? So the plan for the online courses is for them to be video-based, where I'll do screen sharing, and I will literally share my screen and walk through exactly how I do each of those different things. And so for anybody who thinks they might have a synthesizing mind or wants to be a lifelong learner and start getting into some of this stuff, whether it's, for fun in your free time, or if you want to do something entrepreneurship wise, like I do, this will share the ins and outs of everything that I do in my own day-to-day processes and systems I use and things like that. So that'll be the first course. And then there will be a course for each of what I call the Sloww stages. So the first one after that will be intentional living, and then a life purpose course, a mental mastery course, and a spiritual growth course, or what is probably a better term of timeless wisdom course.
Wow. Kyle, those courses I'm eager to take myself, and also to see how those are the kinds of online courses we need in today's world. We need those kind of things to be in the cosmos of consciousness, collective consciousness. And Kyle, I can't thank you enough for joining me today. It's been really eye-opening, and also since I've been following you for a bit now, you've also influenced in the way I see things now, the way I want to see my own time here on Earth. And I can't wait for our listeners to also take a look at what you've worked on and your passions, and also for them to get inspired by you. So thank you for joining me, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Take care.
You too.